What's good, fellas? Welcome to the first episode of Production Diaries. In this podcast, I'll be showing you real examples of metal production, from start to finish. Unlike my main series of videos, this one is going to be more educational, more about the actual process of building things up with detailed explanation of every step. I'll basically give you a trip into whatever happens in my mind during entire process. This episode is brought to you by Nomans Land, Viking metal band from St. Petersburg, Russia. So today we're about to mix a song for them. Actually, band did hell of a service for people such as you and I, allowing to make a video on the song that hasn't been released yet. Of course, we're not gonna spoil the entire thing, so I'd wanted to welcome you all to visit their links down below in order to stay tuned for the actual release. You can also support the band by buying their music on iTunes, Spotify and other music streaming platforms. If you like Viking metal, you may end up with some pretty good songs in your playlist. I personally enjoyed it a lot. And before we'll start, I'd wanted to give huge shout out to all the patrons supporting this channel. This series wouldn't be possible without your help. So let's start our journey from the checkout project. At this point, I'm only trying to focus on what kind of sound we've got to work with. No major focus on musical side of the story. Some guys suggest to give it a listen and sort of feel the song, but let's be honest, you can't really feel anything when you've got DI guitars, unprocessed and unbalanced drums, vocals jumps up and down and all that. So let's give it a short look, trying to make basic judgment of what type of sound we have and what can we possibly do with that. Let's start from bass. The tone is wonderful. Well articulated, rich sounding, no signs of timing issues. The only thing I wasn't sure about is these fading notes. We'll probably gonna use good amount of drive or compression on our bass, so we'll need to compensate loss of dynamics by using fader automation or something like that. Moving on to guitars. Nice timing, good tone and good performance. The only thing I noticed is different lengths of fading notes here. Difference is too big to be compensated with time warping. It will lead to obvious warbling artifacts, so we'll probably have to cut the longer note instead. Other than that, it's all good. Drums. First of all, we need to set up basic panning and get more or less balanced levels. I started with panning overhead channels 100% left and right according to their names. Now we can search for the right panning for other elements. To figure out rough values, just try to memorize stereo placement of particular drum in overheads channel, then simply match the directions. Values are rough, I don't need details just yet, we just need to set it for audition. Let's listen. Okay, so kick is tight as fuck. I like that. Though in and out channels are out of phase. Let's keep that in mind. Good snare with pretty nice bottom mic bleed. Little rainy though. I'm curious if it's possible to fix it with EQ without making it hollow. Toms. Extreme amount of bleed. If you listen closely, you'll notice that Tom 12 is making constant low end noise. According to our panning, it's close to kick, which triggers this resonance. Anyways, I can already say that this type of bleed should be chopped or reduced to the point where it won't mess up tightness of the mix. Depending of processing, Tom's bleed can be nice adjustment to stereo ambience of our drum kit, if not compressed to shit of course. In our case, we'll probably need to get rid of it. However, toms themselves sounds pretty good. Great overheads, nice stereo image and pretty good tone. What's good about it is that hi-hat level is not exaggerated, pretty much the same as other cymbals, so we may get away without using additional mic at all or use it in a very low proportion. However, if hi-hat would be too loud, we could use its channel as a source for sidechain ducking on overheads. Speaking of ride channel, we'll need it for sure, because it's kind of quiet on overheads. Good tone on hi-hat mic. Right is little muddy, but I'm sure it's just a question of minor EQ tweaks. And finally room mic. Pretty nice. Last thing to check is the ending. That's how you end your songs, guys. No need to let the world know that you got the shit, that's what your performance should tell instead. Just freeze for some time and let the drums fade out, your engineer gonna thank you later. So, great sound and great performance. Moving on to vocals.
Steel and frost, cold steel winds, for many years, together they roll. Faith, passion, sorrow and pain.
Main vocals sounds good, good performance and no signs of major timing issues. Of course channels are not perfectly synchronized, but I doubt if it's even possible to sing exact same thing exactly the same over and over. We'll fix it with vocal line. At this point I'm happy that we don't have room response, headphones bleed, or anything like that. Same goes for back vocals, check this out.
Melodious words.
Fuck me. Now clean vocals.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Their looks will show you all. Throw scars on their...
Again, no major timing issues, just nice manly singing.
Silence in Drakkar. Silence.
And whisper tracks are as good as they can be. No digital clipping on vocal tracks, in fact there's no clipping on any of stems, which I really appreciate. Now we can decide what our first move will be. In this case I wanted to mess around with drum tone first, just to see if I can come up with something. So let's get a nice foundation for our mix. You guys know that I'm not a big fan of production concept where mixing and mastering are separated. So I usually slowly build up both mix and master chains. At this point we're gonna keep it simple, sort of preview thing. So I use an LS bus with no drive, just to get some saturation and peak dynamics reduction. Pretty transparent multiband compressor. Multiband exciter and tape mode. At this point I don't care about any kind of gain staging, so the overall effect of this thing is mostly boost of volume, but still there is some nice distortion. Kramer tape with overloaded input. Effect of this one is more noticeable. I mostly use it for gluing. And limiter is just for output protection. So total effect is just light gluing. Since we've got pretty good source tone, I decided not to go extreme and just open up existing potential of the kit. So first of all I reverse the phase of kicks out channel so there's no phase issues between both. Then used hell ton of drive with NLS and mic mode on both tracks, just to get some brightness and power to start with. Then I used faders to get basic balance between mix. We're dealing with metal, so tight and clicky internal mix should prevail. External microphone should be adjusted to the point where kick starts to be full enough. However, some styles like jazz may require totally opposite concept where outside microphone is the keeper, or maybe even the only available mic. So now we can route both tracks to self-titled bus and start working on some. First of all I used EQ to bring down resonating lows and boxy mids, getting more focused sounding as a result. CLA 76 with factory kick preset and about 3 decibels of gain reduction. Making sound little fuller. Fab filter Saturn with some more drive, though I used it mostly to reduce bleed and emphasize the actual hits by using this dynamics knob. Next in chain, multi-bin compressor. I pretty much use some factory preset to get more focus and tightness. Another NLS module making our kick more glued and aggressive. I also used dual mono mode so left and right channels have little difference in saturation, which leads to subtle stereo randomization, moving our kick from being dead center. Little correction with EQ. And final thing is solid boost of low end with our bass exciter. And then I decided to go back and apply this little EQ adjustment, just to make our kick a little brighter. When it comes to snare, we should use pretty much the same balancing concept. Top mic is the main, while bottom one should be adjusted until overall some starts to become bright and rich. So I balanced the mix and checked for phase issues between snare and overheads. Sometimes you can get much brighter and punchy sounding using phase reverse, but in this case there was no effect whatsoever, so I started to make my first moves on channels. Notching out fundamental rainy frequency on top mic. Bottom mic. Getting rid of lows together with outstanding mids. Also we make it a little brighter. There is solid amount of bleed, so I tried to reduce it with Transient Designer. Now both tracks can be united under snare bus. Overall effect of this chain is gain of density. We're not gonna change the tone much. First of all I used EQ to bring down outstanding mid-range resonances together with unwanted low end. Subtle touch on dynamics, about 3 decibels of gain reduction. So we get boost of 30 milliseconds attack, while rainy tail remains more or less at the same level, thanks to slow release and gain compensation. Additional touch on dynamics with Saturn. Pretty much the same thing we did earlier. Then we make our snare fuller with isotope exciter. Higher bands remain inactive, otherwise tone could become too aggressive. Post-correction with EQ. Getting rid of ringy mids together with another outstanding zone. Pretty much the same Pro-C preset we used earlier, just little more compression. And final thing, NLS with extreme drive, same old purposes. As I said earlier, we've got pretty good balance on overheads, so I'm not gonna change it much. There was no reason to have them separated cause I didn't plan to mess with panning, so I used pre-bounced some of both panned 100% left and right. First thing I did is tone correction to get brighter and cleaner sounding. I didn't like muddy mids coming from hi-hat. Same goes for whistles on higher mids. Subtle compression with SSL. It mostly reacts to popping snare and rare loud cymbals. Don't mind solid boost of loudness, later I used channels fader to find proper balance anyways. And final tone correction brings down snare's resonance on mids, plus additional moves on highs. Now it's time to add the hi-hat. I used little exaggerated balance so all the dirtiness is obvious enough for timbre correction. And that's pretty much all I did here. As I already said, there is pretty good balance on overheads and I didn't think that hi-hat needs additional emphasis. Instead I used reversed panning and got pretty interesting wide type of sounding. Completely different story with ride though. This time I actually wanted to emphasize its bleed from overheads, so I kept original panning and used EQ to adjust the channel's content until the overall sum sounds good for my ears, all done on top of overheads of course. Processing of toms is pretty much the same for all channels. First of all I use NLS with extreme drive which helps our toms to cut through the mix better. And then this kind of EQ. First band is reduction of resonating fundamental frequency. It's different for each tom depending of the tuning. Other bands remain the same for all three channels, which means that we cut off unwanted boxiness and emphasize clicky attack. You can see that I edited out unwanted bleed for reasons mentioned earlier. I could also save the bleed by using EQ to get rid of those resonances, but it would be destructive for the actual tom's sounding, so it's better to cut this stuff out completely. Processing of room is the most extreme thing in this case. I started from cutting off unwanted high end. It didn't sound bad or anything, I just didn't want it to conflict with brightness of overheads, so we free some space for them in higher regions. Now I wanted to give it some stereo processing, which can't be done on mono channel, so I routed it to this stereo bus where I can actually use stereo plugins. So first thing is NLS with maximum drive and independent distortion for left and right channels. Little more colors and wideness. Tone correction. then C4 with some factory preset. I'm not really sure how to describe the effect. I feel like drum sounds more packed together, little more punchy and not so linear or whatever. Then I've had an idea of making this channel like really wide. So just to get a basic idea of how it can sound, I simply reversed phase of right channel. Basically we just swap mid and side components of stereo, and that actually sounded pretty cool. Even cooler with little EQ of side components so nothing jumps out too much. Last thing is reverb. So I grabbed some random preset from my latest mixing guide. Little timbre correction on top, nothing important. This channel receives signals from kick, snare, toms and some from overheads. Alright, so we pretty much have something. The only thing that bothered me is snare drum, probably because I'm fucking suck at mixing and use all that natural sounding thing to make excuses. I've had a choice of trying to push it, change the tone, do some crazy shit and hope for the best. Or I could simply use some triggers on top of what we've got already. So I opened up the current MMG I was working on, which by the way is almost ready, will be there pretty soon. Anyways, I got rid of everything that has nothing to do with snare, then loaded the audio of snare's top mic. And guess what? Simply placed every note in the right position by hands. Might sound hard, but it really took me about 20 minutes to complete. Just draw a note, hit Ctrl+C to put it in your buffer, and now all you have to do is move this locator to starts of notes and spam Ctrl+V. See, that's actually easy, and what's more important, it's as accurate as you want it to be. You can also use triggering software if you wish. You know what? I wish I could do this too. I actually own Slate Trigger 2 since the first days of release. I thought it will be cool and useful, so I grabbed it right after I saw that cool promo video. So stuff is bought, software installed, and the only thing got triggered that day was me, as I realized that I need to spend additional 100 on USB key drive. Sure, it looks cool and all, but man, really? What's wrong with being able to use just any USB key drive like Revolver does? At that moment of time it wasn't so popular, so I should also wait for shipment, and that was very sad. So much sad that I pretty much got used to do it manually, though I may activate my license someday. By the way, I also own Steven Slate Drums 5 now, and guess what? It doesn't work in 32 bits. I mean 64-bit has all that accuracy and stuff, but it would be cool to have an option of 32 bits or maybe even 16-bit version of software in order to work with projects that require mastering for CD. So Steven, please fix this for people such as I, or at least release the Howie Weinberg mastering processor. So after this whole thing was done, I started to edit velocity separately for each channel. Each layer should sound as natural as possible, following original snare dynamics. Processing of these triggers will be reviewed in the upcoming video, so let's pass it for now. The only thing I've added is this additional rainy snare. Nothing but a limiter on board. So once everything was done, I simply used batch export to get set of pre-processed triggers. Back to our project. As you can see, stems are already imported. Tricky part about them is the way it's supposed to be used. These purple colored tracks should go to master bus together with other instruments, while green ones are totally different. These triggers designed to go straight to limiter, sort of passing master chain and laying on top of the mix, giving it extra clean details. So in order to perform this trick, I created post-master bus called limiter, routed old master to this one. So our drums and purple triggers are going to master bus, receive all that compression and saturation, then this whole thing sums together with green triggers on limiter bus to get final compression. By the way, I've added about 5 decibels of gain here. Top-down move, so I did it at the end, still it will give us better context during review. Original snare is now routed to snare mount bus. This way I'm able to switch it off and still have reverb response. That's where its name originates from. Don't worry, we will bring it back after some work on triggers. Now let's slowly bring the triggers in, starting from master snare top trigger. It gives us nice short pop. The only thing I did on top of it is small EQ correction to reduce boomy lows and mids. Those triggers are designed to be passed through specific master chain, so obviously we must tweak the channels according to new one. Roomy trigger. Processing of this one belongs to upcoming project. Basically it's all about having scooped and extremely compressed sounding on the output. So I use some EQ and limiter with extreme settings. Also subtle width reduction. What bothered me is one particular hit that sounded sort of out of overall sample sequence. Let me find the sneaky bastard. This one. There is hell ton of ring comparing to other samples. In order to combat the issue, I used multi-band compressor. Only one band is active, limiting the range of unwanted resonance. So one sample is triggered, it will put the resonance down, while other samples remain pretty much the same. Now it's time to bring up reverb. Small EQ correction on top, not so boomy. Let's bring back original snare and mix it with triggers in a good proportion. In order to simplify all the changes, I use Pro Q for both EQ and level balancing. Basically I did high-end cut to open up the space for nice and clean trigger attack and get rid of all that annoying bleed. I also reduced rainy part of spectrum. Resulting tone is mixed with triggers after 4 decibels of attenuation, just enough for snare to take proper place in the mix. Continue to bring stuff in with limiter snare trigger. Small correction of muddy mids. Ringy snare limiter trigger. Here I'm using equalizers and compressor to bring down annoying resonances and reduce attack just a little. It's not that important, but for some reason I decided to leave only central part of stereo. Last part is this limiter transient trigger. Very subtle effect. And for some weird reason I decided to cut some stuff. Honestly, I don't think that it's so important. Not sure what I was thinking of. We're done with channel processing, and since I was pretty happy with the way this kit sounds, I decided not to change it all that much, and adjust the limiter level slightly lower of the point where it starts squashing snare hits, keeping in mind that we still need to bring in guitars and bass, so I also left even more room for that. That's where this gain value comes from, and for the most part we're not gonna change it. At this point I decided that it's time to bring in guitars, bass and vocals, and before we'll go for that, I want to simplify this session by rebouncing this drum kit, sort of lock existing results and move on with that. Here you can see how I rearranged the tracks. Export has been done in 32-bit float format, which allowed me to pass 0 decibels limit and safely transfer the audio with source dynamics. Now we should get some guitar tones to work with. I'm doing it in a separate project. At this point I want to get something that sounds more or less good, keeping in mind that tone can be changed anytime, so I'm looking mostly for nice distortion. All existing channels are routed to master bus with settings from Pre-Trigger Drums project for a preview. Check this out. This is one of factory presets. I only added TS-808 with no drive in order to get good articulation. That's really it. Second channel is going to use exact same processing, in only exception of slightly different mic position. This way our rhythm won't be all that simple and boring. And then I used Kramer tape with some EQ. Probably intuitive, it doesn't seem to make much sense now. Panning around 70%, pretty narrow. And for leads I just used processing chain from Metal Mixing Guide number 24. The one from Octave Guitars channel. simply added this Pro C with stock settings to make the sound stable. That's really it, so I simply bounced the stems and moved to bass reamping. When it comes to bass, I'm a real fan of tone layering. The idea is to get several different tones with different types of distortion, like clean, plus soft overdrive, plus fuzz or anything like that. Mixed together in right proportion, it will give you heavy and powerful tone. There is no something like ultimate combination of amps or anything like that, just pick anything you like and see what you can do with that. I started from clean tone using factory preset of bass amp room. Then I used this EQ to cut off the low end. Let's ignore higher band for now. Then I copied the channel and changed type of filter from high pass to low pass. So we basically do crossover. Now we're able to compress the hell out of lows using Saturn's Dynamics option. Just check out the difference. We now have dynamic bass with dense and stable low end. What a charm. Then I've made this little drop on mids for first layer, not a big thing. Now I'm doing pretty much the same thing on second layer, but this time focusing on highs and actually enhancing dynamics. This layer can be used as controller of picking sounding and final mix. Next one, bass 3. First distorted layer. Pretty much use some random preset with more or less focus. Doesn't it look familiar? I guess I pretty much copied first channel and replaced the processor, that's why it's the same. However, high pass filter was a good idea, because adding anything to our clean and stable low end could ruin the whole purpose of crossovering. Or maybe not, it's still a little cleaner though. Fourth channel is fuzzy layer. Check this out. You probably guessed what amp it is, didn't you? Pretty random settings here. Special thing about this preset is this pedal. Yes, it's unplugged, and yes, LED is inactive. Why? Well, that's because I turned it off. There is no cables, so it basically laying around doing nothing and all that. Same kind of high pass together with ghost filters. Those will change the tone of the pedal. Jokes aside, last layer is basically a copy of guitar processing. I only used different mic position. High pass with some cleaning EQ on top. And limiter in order to get really squash type of sounding. That's really it. Let's export this pack and finally go for element integration. Now it's time to start integration of bass and guitars. I basically use master and limiter from last drums project with routing mentioned earlier. Ignore blue tracks for now, we'll need it later. So I pretty much started with bass. All channels except for guitar model are routed to bass bus with basic balancing, which I did on audio itself instead of touching channels levels. So bass 3 layer is 3 decibels louder. And click layer is 12 decibels louder. I know it doesn't make much sense, but you'll get the idea later. At this point, overall level of bass is pretty high. The idea behind this is that it's always better to cut something rather than boost. And if you have the tone, let's say with pretty outstanding mids, you can actually start with level reduction, right until the point where a mid sounds good in the mix, but at the same time you have low bass and highs, so you find yourself boosting stuff anyways. So I prefer to have it a little more exaggerated and start EQ correction right off. Just be careful with cuts and don't go too extreme, think ahead. So this is my first EQ movement, and that's exactly what I told you about. Now I started to hear this annoying whistle around 5 kHz. Just focus on highs while I'm turning this thing off and on. So I tried to cut it right here on bass bus and this shit started to come from overheads. I think I was too focused on this particular zone, so I started to hear it everywhere. I pretty much spotted it on limiter bus using this EQ and applied reduction. I thought it will be temporary movement, but ended up with keeping it here anyways. So that was the first update to our master chain. Subtle pitchy effect with Valhalla Uber mod. It sounds like shit with full amount, but if you add just a bit of it, it can actually add some nice depth and wideness to the sound, sort of fill the gaps. Next step, multiband compressor. Half of effect will come from general level reduction, but at the same time this thing packs our tracks together and sort of put it down in the mix. I really like the way it is starting to sound. At this point I figured out that I didn't glue anything with saturation yet, so I used multiband exciter. Terrific amount of saturation with some gain compensation. So we pretty much going for same level as we did before C4. And that level difference is something that forced me to think that bass is dirty, while it actually could be too loud. So I used EQ to bring down outstanding mids. And you know what? It really was dirty even before C4. Anyways, I used low cut filter to have more focus on upper parts of lows, keeping in mind that it can be useful for RMS boost. Higher left and right bands are just small tone randomization. That was the point where I did my first sidechain movement. Pro C is driven by kick drum and snare sidechain driver channel. This helps to rhythmically glue drums and bass together. Right after I've made a copy of bass 3 to experiment with wideness. Same old trick, simple phase flip of right channel. However, we still need to separate it from the original source. Otherwise right channels are going to cancel each other out, and left channels gonna boost each other. So we need to sort of detach them by bringing up some delay. Simple one, no any feedback or anything like that, we just need to move the track in time to create stable difference in phase correlation. Integrational EQ right after. I tried to put it down as much as possible, with even more phase differences as a side effect. In our case it's a good thing. Then I basically doubled the stereo image. And locked it all dynamically with limiter, so we get more stable input on master bus saturators. Now it was time to go for rhythm guitars. Both routed to dedicated bus. There is also some processing on channels, but let's ignore it just for now. I pretty much started with this correction EQ. Reduction of outstanding mid-range, high-end boost for brightness. Guitars didn't sound all that bad honestly, but what I'm doing here is trying to get it intact with other elements of the mix. Some distortion to compensate spectrum losses and make that change sort of smoother. So as you can see I pretty much messing around at this point. Multiband compressor was top-down movement, so we'll return to it later. Pro C works in sidechain mode. It receives signal from kick and snare sidechain drivers. So we get about 1 decibel of more or less stable gain reduction from kick and short 5 decibels drops from snare. And now it was the time to bring up our last bass stem with guitar reamping on top of it. Routing it to rhythm guitars bus means that we'll get some sort of triple track feeling and better correlation between bass and guitar parts in the mix. So first of all I applied this EQ on the track, just to dive it in. Then I used multi-bin compressor to get basic control on dynamics and sort of glue both bass and guitars together. Last band remains untriggered. That higher region is pretty squashed already, so any compression would act more like stable level drop, which is not what I wanted. Limiter will give us some additional gluing. Please keep in mind that originally there was no difference between gain and output sections. I just included channel level in this value so all other moves can be reviewed using same levels as I used. I don't choose this limiter to gain RMS, more to put stuff little deeper actually. And here is the last spectrum correction move. At this point I decided to do few correction moves on master bus. Some of them was top down though, I'm not really sure of the exact moment I decided to change certain things. First, a major acts as some sort of high pass filter and high end booster for side of the stereo. Valhalla Uber mod. It's pretty much the same preset I used on Metal Mixing Guide 25 Master, that little lo-fi type of thing. Then I used some reference to compare my mix to. So first thing I figured out is my mix is still not wide enough. That's because of narrow panning we used. So instead of going back and changing it, I simply added another imager to match mid-side correlation just a little. Bus compressor with subtle touch on dynamics, about 1 decibel of gain reduction most of the time and 2 during snare drum hits. So we get some nice gluing in the mix. Last thing I did is EQ correction, so I used Isotope Ozone 5 EQ to get snapshots of my mix and reference, then I tried to fine-tune the spectrum using bands instead of automatic curve, however I ended up using only part of this whole correction. This pre-equalization is additional correction of isotope EQ, cause I felt like mix is kind of dirty. Matter fact, it was the right thing to do it on master bus. Correction on sub-levels wouldn't give me proper results, and later I'll show you why. Let's go for leads. All tracks are routed to related bus. There was some pre-panning movements for harmonic lead part, but it's nothing special, just 20% left and right, some kind of that. Lead guitar from first half of the track now remains on its own bus with no panning whatsoever. Still, I used additional panning automation on tracks, so it starts narrow for silent part of instrumental and getting wider as full set of instruments kicks in. Then I created pitched copy of both tracks with some panning on channels too. Important to say that I did this pitch correction on top of reamping chain. If I would do that before of reamping chain, results would be more natural, but that wasn't my goal. I just tried to mess around and see how it sounds. So added to main lead part, this pitched layer will give us some sort of octave or feeling, not that big to be clearly heard though, it's just something that will make our leads richer in the mix. Right after I used EQ on leads bus to fix some resonance issues. It still sounds dirty, pretty much the same as the entire mix, but I wasn't able to notice that just yet. There is also sidechain compressor driven by kick sidechain driver, same old idea. At this point I decided to give a mix some automation. I pretty much chopped some things like bass noises in between notes. So now it will match rhythm guitars better. Green region's color means that I decreased the level, so as you can see we use slightly lower level for guitars when solo kicks in, just to free some space for it. Same goes for bass, but here I only dropped distorted parts of the tone, while main sum of 2 tracks remains untouched. This yellow part means that I used level boost to get bigger pressure and power in the mix, right after the end of solo. And yeah, by the way, I did the same thing for clicky track for first half of the solo, though effect is extremely subtle. So as you can see we can shift the tone drastically by a simple level automation of its parts. I'd wanted to say that there was some pre-rendering thing here, so second reverb track now also includes small amount of signal from guitars and bass. However, it wasn't enough to make those intro parts smooth enough. Even though we did use room simulation on Reamping stage, it sounds kinda dry on top of our drums and bass, so I used slight amount of hull reverb on tracks. Only 2%, but still it fills the space pretty good. Same goes for central lead. I thought it was kind of dry and not wide enough. H delay in ping pong mode fixed the issue. However, I still wanted to have the ability to control it later, so we'll perform little cancellation magic. Last thing I added to the mix is this noise track. I guess the one I used in Metal Mixing Guide number 25, that's how Valhalla Uber mod sounds with one of factory presets, and I use pretty big amount of it. So yeah, it was the time I was happy with mix and decided to go for vocals, but before I did, I pretty much locked the changes inside of the new pack of stems, same as we did before. I didn't mute anything so sidechain routing works properly. Then I did batch export of bass, guitars, leads, bus and noise. Right after I turned off delay on lead track for second pass bounce, now only from leads though. Later you'll see why. Now stems are re-imported to new project where we're going to work on vocals. Same routing with subtle correction here and there, but it's not the point right now. What actually is the point is basic work on vocal tracks. As you remember, we have something like 10. Processing all of them at the same time is not something my CPU would be happy about. Though I could use bus processing for each group, but it wouldn't be as accurate as processing on sub-bus level. There is no real reason to show every track, because I pretty much process it in exact same way, so we'll go just for main vocals double.
Spirit flows,
I wanted to get basic compression so vocals can be more or less stable in the mix.
Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man.
We also getting some saturation and again, dynamic range reduction with Kramer tape.
Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man.
Simple de-esser to get control on outstanding sibilants, which by the way was boosted by previous processing. It's important to do this move after that so it won't be brought back.
Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Heart of this man. Hunger, heart of this man.
Subtle correction of spectrum. I checked for useful signal in the lower register, found the point where there is no any important harmonics and cut that stuff off. There is only low-end noises, hits and things we don't really need. It could be done in front of compressors, and in that case we would get better focus on higher range of spectrum, but that's not a big deal honestly.
Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Emotions and hunger, heart and hunger, heart of this man. Heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man.
Uber mod with same old settings on top.
Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man.
Then I used vocal line to synchronize second track with first one, using it as a guide. As a result we get nice and tight double to work with.
Steel and frost, cold steel winds. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. Growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man.
I did exact same thing for other tracks. Now we can go ahead and process first group of vocals. Again, we are gonna do just the same for others. So both pre-processed tracks are routed to group 3. Group 3 is routed to group 4. It's basically one big chain related to vocals. I just didn't bother with names. For the most part of this audition I'll use Brainworks control to solo center of stereo image. It will help us to get better focus on what's going on between vocals and other mid instruments like kick, bass and so on. If we can clearly hear the vocals in mono, chances are it's gonna be good in stereo too, but of course we'll check it later. I pretty much started with multi-bin compressor. Please keep in mind that we'll have top-down balance changes. It's plus 3 decibels on channels and pretty much the same amount of gain on buses. It wasn't that extreme when I started, so let's just ignore this level difference for now. For the most part it works on outstanding bumps of dynamics. This time we're working on entire set of tracks, getting stable sum on output. Last band is used as additional de-esser.
Cold steel winds, growing emotions and hunger, heart of this man. For many years, together they roll, frost.
Next thing, sidechain compressor driven by kick and master snare, getting basic correlation between vocals and other instruments.
For many years, together they roll, rose, cold steel winds, roaring marshes and hunger, heartless men.
Then I use saturator in front of compressor. Settings are pretty subtle, just a little gluing.
For many years, together they roll, back up and fight, letting go as one rose.
Basic timbre fix. It's easy to focus on unwanted stuff since we're only listening to central part of our mix.
Cold steel winds, hunger, heartless men. For many years, back up and fight. Letting go as one rose. Cold steel winds, roaring marshes and hunger, heartless men.
NLS with decent amount of saturation and little gain compensation.
For many years, together they roll, back up and fight, letting go as one rose. Cold steel winds, roaring marshes and hunger.
Again, little more distortion and dynamic stability. Now second part of processing. At this point I panned channels little bit off center. And then used a major to control the width.
Roaring marshes and hunger, heartless men. Roaring marshes and hunger, heartless men. Roaring marshes and hunger.
Very subtle thing. Now I was listening to full stereo and it seemed that we need just a bit more highs.
Heartless heartless men, roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men, roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men, roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men.
Then I started to add some space to really dive vocals into the mix. I used Valhalla Room for some nice long reverb.
Roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men. Roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men. Roaring.
H delay on first group. I might actually do it earlier.
Marshes and hunger. Heartless men. Roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men. Roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men.
It only works in mono mode, unlike this second delay with exaggerated stereo.
Roaring marshes and hunger. Heartless men. For many years, together they roll.
Then I use multiband exciter in mid-side mode in order to get slightly wider stereo image. Only higher bands of side are working here, nothing extreme.
Roaring marshes and hunger, heartless men.
And now I'm using T-Rack's vintage compressor with factory preset called vocals. It's gonna leave side information uncompressed, while central part is gonna get pretty soft and nice gain reduction.
growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man, growing. Heartless man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man.
As a result, we'll get stable dynamics and wider stereo image. However, right after I'm using sidechain compressor in the exact opposite way. Mid part of stereo remains untouched, while side is gonna receive ducking from kick and master snare.
This man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man.
We now got it well integrated. Next thing I did was adding this octave layer to vocals.
Hunger. Heartless man.
I didn't do it to get brutal sounding or anything like that, it's just gonna give us slightly fuller sounding on output. Here I used Pro Q to get rid of outstanding stuff.
Growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man, growing marshes.
Pretty extreme saturation on top to dive it in.
Heartless man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man.
See, we can't hear it on vocals that much, nor will be able to do so in full mix. At this point we have pretty good vocals, so it's time to bounce the stem and proceed with other packs. I actually did it 2 times. In a way it already is, plus with all delays and reverbs turned off. As a result we're getting wet and dry tracks, I'm talking about space processing.
Growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man, growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man.
And if I reverse the phase of one, dry signals will cancel each other out, giving us isolated space as a result.
Growing this man.
Of course there is minor saturation artifacts, but it's not that matter. What matters now we have the ability to control amount of space without any need to rebuild the chain and recalculating percents to decibels and all that.
And hunger. Growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man. Growing marshes and hunger. Heartless man. Growing marshes and hunger.
I also bounced signal from group 3 just in case. You'll see how we're gonna use it very soon. And before we'll go for final work on packs of vocals, let me just show you what I did with stems of instrumental. First thing is subtle editing of kick drum track. There were some random spikes here and there. Extremely subtle correction of highs on track itself, doesn't really matter. Rhythm guitars now have 2 additional reverb layers. First one is extremely short chamber, sounds more like ambience room. and second one is same type of reverb, but with much higher decay time plus stereo image is half as wide. Lead space part is now less fuzzy and actually much wider. Plus there is level automation, so delay is dropped when there is no rhythm guitars on top. I just wanted it to be less obvious for a listener. Bass tone is now slightly more clear and powerful. Now we're gonna free some space for our vocals. That's where Group 3 exports come in handy. Each one of them has silent output and 3 sends to sidechain compressors on reverb 2, bass and main rhythm guitars. All compressors work slightly different, so check this out. Compression of main reverb will help us to get more headroom for vocal space. Compressor on guitars working only for center of stereo, leaving side untouched, so we'll get some minor ducking in center, leaving more space for dry vocals. Exactly opposite thing for side of bass, only side is processed this time. To sum it all up, we have small gain reduction for secondary parts of the tones. Guitars are stereo, so compressing just mono gives us extremely subtle effect. Same goes for bass, we're not touching all that powerful tone, just reduce the width leaving more space for vocal reverbs and delays. It's like instruments automatically rebalance themselves according to what's happening in the mix at the current moment of time. Now it's time for full vocals integration. As I said, algorithm of getting those packs of stems is the same. We now have 3 groups: main, extreme, chorus, clean and whispering vocal packs. We basically simplified everything and made it easy to operate. Let's start from main vocals pack.
Growing marshes and hunger, heartless men, for many years, together they roll, back up and fight, they go as one.
This entire chain is pretty subtle thing. To sum it up, we've got rid of some stuff that I didn't like for some reason, making it all a little brighter at the same time.
Growing marshes and hunger, heartless men, for many years, together they roll.
This last EQ is automated to cut some whistly type of noise in one particular place.
Victory to come, to come, to come, victory to come.
Vocals space track only receives sidechain ducking from main dry track, so it kind of opens up for space decay parts.
Growing marshes and hunger, heartless men, for many years, together they roll, back up and fight, they become.
Now chorus vocals. Let's actually listen to it in mono.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Their looks will show you. Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Those scars from their sunburned images, frozen fury, joy and will.
So first thing is this EQ with drop on outstanding mid-range. Sounds kind of like a phone or something.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar.
Then I've made it slightly more powerful with boost on bass.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar.
Extremely subtle multiband compression with de-essing on higher band.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar.
Additional balancing of timbre.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Then will show you all. Those scars from their sunburned images, fury, joy and will.
Higher band is pre-correction for next move, which is tape distortion exclusively for higher mid-range and highs. As a result, vocals are slightly more clear and emphasized.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar.
Processing of space cancellation is mostly targeted to mid-range reduction. I wanted it to be more scooped comparing to verses.
Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Let the silence reign in Drakkar.
So I used basic timbre correction with gain compensation. Multiband compressor controls outstanding pressure of second band.
Their sunburned images, through scars on their sunburned images,
And final scooping on mids.
through scars on their sunburned images, through scars on their sunburned images.
Now whisper parts.
Silence. In Dragar. In Dragar.
I guess I just wanted it to be smoother, little out of front.
In Dragar. Dragar.
Space cancellation is wider and receives sidechain ducking from dry track.
In Dragar. Silence. Silence. In Dragar. Silence.
And there is no processing on last pack whatsoever.
In Dragar. Silence. In Dragar.
There is also some reversed reverb things here and there.
Steel and frost.
Delay helps it to fade out into the mix slow and nice, otherwise it could sound like sudden loss of something. Pretty extreme ducking from kick, which again helps to bury this effect inside of the mix.
Steel and frost.
Very last thing was routing all vocal tracks to a related bus, because I noticed that there is hell ton of noise on tracks, so I pretty much cancelled it out using isotope denoiser, old version by the way. Honestly, I exaggerated needed effect, so it also cancels some useful stuff, giving a sort of lo-fi effect when delays fading out, and I fucking love it.
Glory and mercies and hunger, heartless men. For many years, together they row. Back up and fight. They become.
So that's where I thought I'm happy with mix and sent this version for a review. Feedback was positive, However, it was mentioned that vocals and leads sounds bit harsh. I'll spoil it. Problem was both whistly elements of mix and its interaction with master bus. I was afraid to touch sub-master level, because effect would be brought back by master. Same goes for fixing it on master bus. This move would be too extreme and wouldn't fix the issues on sub-master level, so I decided to go ahead and see if there is something I can do about it. So I basically wanted to look inside of the mix. I wanted to understand what really happens with each element after it passes master chain. Let's take rhythm guitars for example. If we only pass it through master chain and solo, there won't be any clipping on NLS bus. Multiband compressor won't be triggered properly, providing wrong compression and wrong spectrum balance between bands. Then Kramer tape. Again, it won't be loaded heavy enough, providing much cleaner saturation. Chances are, bus compressor won't be triggered at all, simply boosting level by the amount of output gain compensation. Don't need to say that limiter may not even start any compression. That basically means that signal is going to sound different, and I wanted to know exactly what this difference is in order to do troubleshooting. I basically wanted my master chain to work exactly the same way all the time, even if only one stem is active. For that purpose I broke it down to modules that's sensitive and not sensitive to the income. Not sensitive modules such as equalizers and stereo enhancers are going to give us exact same processing all the time. Think of it as having 10 tracks, simple digital EQ with bell filter on each, versus raw channels routed to bus where we only have one EQ with same filter. It's gonna sound the same. So we can kind of ignore those modules marked with no. What we can't simulate though is saturators. I wish there would be a way to use external control signal for them, but there is not such option unfortunately. I found that effect of exciter is not really that dramatic if do proper gain compensation, so we can ignore that as well. However, heavy loaded Kramer tape is the issue. It provides pretty noticeable tone changes and crispy distortion on top of mix. Same goes for NLS, though effect is not that dramatic, but still we won't get that overall clipping of some. But here is the thing, I may actually want to have little more clean and dynamic sounding. You'll get it later, I'm not gonna spoil it just yet. And what we actually can simulate is work of compressors. It would be simple if there would be an option of external side chain, but we can totally recreate it in other way. Let's take multiband compressor. We could simply print the audio just in front of it, bounce it in 32-bit float, then activate the side chain, turn off the output of printed track and send it to drive the compressor. In this case it would work in exact same way all the time, because input is now independent. And that's how I simulated this whole module. I basically printed the mix right before the compressor. Then I used same signal on 4 different channels. Each channel should represent one particular band of compressor, so I just used solo buttons for first band, second and so on to separate bands regions. We obviously have all the compression bypassed. This is our driver channels. Now I broke down master bus to 2 parts. Pre-master is modules in front of compressor, in our case just NLS. And second part is basically old master bus minus NLS and compressor. Pre-master has been routed to 4 FX channels for parallel processing, output of bus itself is turned off. And guess what? We're using same type of crossovering as we did before. Those channels are routed to master bus then. The only thing left is to simulate the actual compression. In this case I found that stock compressor pretty much do the same work if set it up with the same settings. Each of these compressors work in sidechain mode, with control signal coming from a related sidechain source. So once any signal goes to pre-master bus, it's getting saturation, then separates to different parts of spectrum and each band will be compressed according to the outcome of yellow tracks, which is the same all the time. Let's solo rhythm guitars only and check this out. So I think you got the idea. The only thing left is to simulate work of compressor on old limiter bus. So again, I separated limiter bus to pre-limiter and export buses, before and after old compressor. Pretty much the same way I use printed signal taken from pre-limiter bus for external side chaining. This high-pass filter is important as we used this option in old compressor. I'm not sure about exact quantity of this cut though, 12 decibels per octave sounded close. So the signal goes to SSL, don't mind gain staging here and there, especially in front of compressor. I've searched for the exact same result using phase reverse test, those values are important. So same story, signal from pre-limiter bus goes to this side chain pass channel, receives compression controlled by the outcome of purple channel, then go to export bus for final processing including limiting. I think you guessed it right, we're now going to pass each stem through this entire chain excluding limiter, one stem at the time. Total sum then can be limited again in next project and should sound close to what we already have, but actual channels won't be linked by bus processing anymore. Though some stems ended up being summed into one, here's the list. I also used additional export of the entire sum in order to check if fully loaded saturators make much sense, and what's more important, if this difference is even something that we need. All stems are now back together in master project. Let's actually go top down for a moment. I want you to understand what kind of changes in the overall sounding we're looking for. So that annoying and unstable whistle was the main problem, that's what I wanted to fix. Of course it is all subjective. Some records may have this type of resonances. It may sound weird as you got used to how it sounded in the past, pretty much the same way I did, but audition in different environments, different levels and enough time in between of them simply proved that this noise is not something I want. Now let's check out the difference between full and stem separated versions of master with same limiter on top. During this audition I want you to pay attention only to distortion and cracking sounds. There will also be a lot of pitchy type of effects. That actually comes from Uber mod modulation. Each time it's different so effects are stacking on top of each other instead of being cancelled out. Just try to ignore it and focus on distortion and pumping. That's what I meant by gluing the mix. I honestly think that it sounds kind of cool and warm, so since we lost part of that effect, let's go ahead and recreate it just a little on master mix bus. All of our pre-processed stems are routed to this one. So I use NLS bus in mic mode with some drive. -2 decibels level drop in front of NLS and +2 decibels boost right after. That allows the plugin to work in higher headroom region. So we can adjust the level of incoming signal, which means control of distortion, and then simply compensate that and have pure effect without level differences. Additionally, we'll use multi-band compressor to control lower mids. So only one band is working, reacting to snare drum hits with subtle gain reduction. This way we'll bury the snare in the mix just a little bit more, at the same time get slight emphasis on its attack. Old limiter is replaced with this one. Pretty much the same settings, I only changed the style of limiting. Now it's gonna be dynamic. I feel like mix is little more open comparing to the old one. Compression is also little lower now. So as you can hear, difference is still very subtle if any. You already know what we're targeting for, so let's go for channels corrections one by one. I used single EQ for every step I did, slowly adjusting my tones to the point where it takes better place in the mix, remaining nice and clean. So as you can hear, it's pretty much the same range all the time. I think it's caused by both pre-master level problems and master saturation, because I can clearly hear that whistle on the noise track, which is pretty transparent thing. Maybe I'm making stuff up, maybe it's actually a problem, but still it was my decision to have this filtering. This entire set of corrections in the same zone was then compensated just a little with this EQ on master bus. Very subtle and wide boost. As you can see, I used stem separation for vocals, soloing choruses on this second track. Both receive same EQ correction of high-end noises, while choruses will also get extremely subtle de-essing and pretty solid stereo enhancement.
Growing mercies and hunger, heartless men. For back up and fight. They become as one. Let the silence reign in Drakkar. Their looks will show you all. Looks will show. Their looks will. Their looks will show you all. Throw scars on their sunburned images. Their looks will show you. Throw scars on their sunburned images.
There is also additional layers of pre-process effects. Nice and long reverb, just to give little more central depth to chorus singing.
Silence raining dry. Throw scars on burned images. Frozen fury, joy and will.
And additional reversed reverb for whispering parts. Narrower stereo image and some delay on top to get smooth fading out.
Silence. Frozen fury, joy and will.
And that's pretty much it for processing. There was also automated stereo enhancer on master. I set it up to move stereo width from 100% to 105% for choruses. Unfortunately, when I reopened the project, all automation has been lost, so just keep in mind that there was little movement of stereo on master bus. Now we can render entire mix for final editing and export. There is no need to use 32-bit floating point, cause our mix won't pass 0 decibels, so I'll go for 24-bit with activation of oversampling on limiter to reduce aliasing. Now it's time to trim the audio and print final results in different formats. So I've made this first cut as a starting point, muting all the noise right before the first hit. We'll basically have 100 milliseconds of silence at the beginning. Same goes for fade out, but that's for a different reason. When we'll use MP3 as the export format, its ending is going to be slightly off the rendering region we set up. Ending before full audio fade out will provide click, caused by wave being out of center. So it's important to check this stuff with some test exports. Last thing I did before MP3 export is subtle region automation of levels. At this point we're looking for different amounts of clipping caused by MP3 encoding. So our verses remain the same, minus 0.3 decibels of peak headroom. Choruses go up to minus 0.1, providing little more distortion. And outro part with guitar solo will have minus 0.5 peak headroom, which means rare clipping with smoother sounding. So that's pretty much it, guys. If you're interested in final results in context of a full song, please follow links in the description and visit band's pages in social media to stay tuned for the release. I'd wanted to say huge thanks to Nomans Land for being part of this video. Thanks to all my patrons who made it possible to run this channel full time. Thanks to all you guys for watching. I'll see you soon in the next one.